Let's talk about the number that's been making headlines again: 1 trillion. Not in investment, not in innovation, but in waste. That's the amount some economists now estimate was squandered due to a series of decisions made during the Trump administration. This isn't just about abstract figures or political blame games. This is about what those trillions could have meant for ordinary working Americans. Roads, schools, healthcare, infrastructure, but instead they vanished into defense boondoggles, corporate giveaways, and mismanaged economic policy. Let's go back. In 2017, the so called Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed, framed as a bold economic revitalization plan. It slashed corporate taxes from 35% to 21%. We were told this would unleash growth, create jobs, and trickle prosperity down to working families. But what happened? Corporations took those savings and spent over $1 trillion, not on wage increases, not on hiring, not on research, but on stock buybacks. A maneuver that enriches shareholders and executives while doing virtually nothing for the broader economy. That's not job creation. That's legalized looting of public wealth. But the losses didn't stop there. Let's talk about tariffs, the so called trade war. Remember that. A high stakes gamble that turned out to be more of a costly stunt than a strategic economic shift. American farmers lost billions. Exporters were hammered. Prices went up for working families. The administration responded by authorizing $28 billion in farm bailout payments, most of which went to large agribusinesses, not small family farms. That's more taxpayer money, more public wealth, shifted into private hands under the illusion of economic nationalism. And we can't forget the hollowing out of federal agencies meant to regulate finance, labor, and the environment. These cuts didn't save money, they cost us. In deregulating Wall Street, loosening labor protections, and gutting environmental oversight, the administration sowed the seeds of long term instability. The real price, harder to calculate, but very real: environmental degradation, unsafe workplaces, a growing financial bubble, and when crises hit, as they always do under deregulated capitalism, it's the public who pays. We're looking at $1 trillion hemorrhage, not in one blow, but death by 1,000 cuts. A tax code rigged for the top, trade wars that backfired, bailouts disguised as subsidies, an open door for lobbyists and cronies to write policy. This is not just economic mismanagement, it is a case study in how capitalism, when left unchallenged, becomes a vehicle for upward wealth redistribution. Let's think about what 1 trillion could have done. Universal pre-K for every child in the United States, funded for over a decade. Free college tuition for every student in public universities for years. Modernizing every road, bridge, and water system in the country. Instead, we got more private jets, record Wall Street profits, and a country more divided than ever between the billionaire class and the rest of us. And now we are told, well, the stock market is up. Yes, it is, because the very policies that stripped the public coffers were designed to inflate asset prices. If you own stocks, great, but 60% of Americans don't own a single share, so who benefited? Not the nurses, not the teachers, not the small business owners. The spoils of those decisions flowed upward again. In 2017, the Trump administration pushed through a major overhaul of the U.S. tax code known as the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. This legislation was sold to the American public as a pro-growth policy aimed at revitalizing the economy, boosting wages, and generating a wave of domestic job creation. Central to the reform was the dramatic reduction of the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. Supporters argued that this would free up capital for companies to invest in their workforce, expand operations, and spark a new era of prosperity for all. But what unfolded in the months and years following the tax cut was far from the promised economic resurgence for working Americans. Instead, the primary beneficiaries were large corporations and their shareholders, as over 1,000 trillion was funneled into stock buybacks, a financial maneuver that does nothing to improve the productive capacity of the economy or enhance job quality. Stock buybacks, at their core, are a tool used by companies to repurchase their own shares from the open market. This reduces the number of shares outstanding, artificially inflating earnings per share and often boosting stock prices. Executives and major investors whose compensation is frequently tied to stock performance benefit enormously from this process. And that's exactly what happened after the tax cuts were enacted. Corporations, flush with new tax savings, chose not to reinvest significantly in their workers or long-term productivity, but instead prioritized buybacks and dividend increases. The scale was staggering. In 2018 alone, S&P 500 companies spent a record $80.6 billion on buybacks. By the end of 2019, the total across 2 years had surpassed $1 trillion. This wasn't a minor shift in corporate strategy. It was a systemic move that revealed the true intentions behind the tax policy. Instead of reinvesting in communities, raising wages, or increasing employment, many corporations used the windfall to enrich their leadership and largest shareholders. This dynamic further exacerbated income inequality, as the wealthiest 10% of Americans own over 85% of all stocks. The average worker saw little to no benefit. In fact, studies showed that wage growth during this period remained sluggish, and job creation followed similar trends to pre-tax cut years, indicating that the cuts had little measurable impact on employment trends. Moreover, the rhetoric used to justify the corporate tax cuts was misleading from the start. Proponents argued that the United States had the highest corporate tax rate in the world, but this figure ignored the effective tax rate, what corporations actually pay after deductions and loopholes. In reality, many Fortune 500 companies already paid far less than the statutory 35% rate. Post-reform, some of the largest corporations paid zero in federal income taxes while still reporting billions in profits. The tax law only further enabled these outcomes, making it easier for large companies to avoid taxation while pretending to stimulate the economy. The prioritization of shareholder enrichment over real economic development reflects a broader trend in American capitalism. When corporations are given the choice between investing in long-term innovation or pursuing short-term financial gains, the latter almost always wins. The Trump-era tax cuts simply provided a legal framework and incentive structure to accelerate this process. CEOs were rewarded for pushing stock prices higher, not for creating jobs or increasing production. The economic narrative of trickle-down prosperity was exposed as nothing more than a talking point, a means to sell a policy designed by and for the wealthiest strata of society. What's particularly revealing is how disconnected these corporate decisions were from the actual economic conditions of the time. Despite record profits and reduced tax burdens, companies claimed they lacked the incentive to boost worker pay or expand operations. This suggests that the real barrier to economic progress wasn't taxation, but a lack of corporate accountability and an over-reliance on market mechanisms to deliver public goods. The tax cut did not unleash capital in any meaningful sense. It merely concentrated wealth further in the hands of those who already controlled it. That wealth did not circulate through the economy, but was instead hoarded or reinvested in ways that primarily benefited elites. The consequences of this decision will be felt for years. Not only did the federal deficit balloon due to reduced corporate revenue, but the opportunity cost of this policy was enormous. The government gave up $1 trillion in potential public investment for the sake of private gain. This is money that could have been directed toward infrastructure, education, clean energy, or healthcare. Instead, it was handed over to corporations with no strings attached, no requirement to hire, innovate, or improve worker conditions. This approach reflects a deeply flawed economic philosophy, one that assumes the interests of corporations and the public are inherently aligned, when in practice they often diverge dramatically. The corporate tax cuts also failed to deliver on their promise of bringing offshore profits back into the U.S. economy. While the reform included provisions intended to encourage repatriation of foreign earnings, the reality was disappointing. Much of the repatriated money followed the same pattern: stock buybacks, executive compensation, and shareholder dividends. The broader economy saw little improvement. Small businesses didn't receive the same kinds of benefits. Workers didn't see significant wage gains. And communities across the country continued to struggle with underfunded schools, decaying infrastructure, and stagnant job markets. This episode is a case study in how economic policy can be weaponized to serve the interests of the few at the expense of the many. By slashing corporate taxes without demanding any tangible return for the public, the administration effectively transferred public wealth into private hands. It was a policy rooted in ideology rather than evidence, designed to deliver political points and campaign contributions rather than lasting economic progress. The $1 trillion spent on buybacks didn't build a single bridge, train a single worker, or heal a single patient. It served no productive public purpose. It deepened inequality, weakened the government's fiscal position, and undermined trust in the political system. The Trump administration's trade war was launched with the promise of restoring American greatness by recalibrating the country's position in global commerce, especially with China. Tariffs, we were told, would be a strategic weapon, forcing foreign powers to play fair, boosting domestic manufacturing, and leveling the playing field for American workers. But what followed was an economic chain reaction that not only backfired on multiple fronts, but resulted in a significant loss of public funds and widespread economic confusion. At the heart of this miscalculation was the myth that tariffs imposed on foreign goods would primarily hurt foreign producers. In practice, the burden of these tariffs fell overwhelmingly on American consumers, manufacturers, and farmers, triggering retaliation abroad and requiring billions of dollars in bailout payments from the federal government to keep key industries afloat. Rather than a demonstration of economic strength, the trade war quickly became an expensive policy failure. American farmers were among the earliest and hardest hit. China, once the largest buyer of U.S. soybeans and other agricultural products responded to U.S. tariffs by slapping their own tariffs on American exports. This immediately dried up a crucial export market, leaving farmers with unsold crops and plummeting prices. The Trump administration attempted to contain the political fallout by launching a massive bailout program, distributing over $28 billion in aid between 2018 and 2020. Yet this aid was not distributed equitably. The lion's share went to large agribusinesses and corporate farming operations, not the small family farms that were supposed to be the symbolic backbone of American agriculture. While the headlines spoke of emergency relief, the reality was more of the same, a policy that shifted public wealth into the hands of the already powerful. The tariffs also introduced a wave of uncertainty that disrupted supply chains and raised costs for American manufacturers. Many industries, from automotive to electronics to construction, depend on imported raw materials or components. When the cost of these imports rose due to tariffs, so did the cost of production. Some companies passed these increases on to consumers, leading to price hikes on everything from appliances to clothing. Others absorbed the costs, leading to lower profits, hiring freezes, or outright layoffs. This inflationary pressure, paired with declining export opportunities due to retaliatory tariffs from Europe, China, and others, meant that American businesses were squeezed from both ends. What was billed as a show of strength quickly revealed itself as a policy rooted in economic nationalism, but divorced from global realities. Retailers also bore the brunt of tariff-related costs, with over 40% of consumer goods in the U.S. imported from China. Tariffs on those goods amounted to a hidden tax on working and middle-class families. Everyday items like electronics, toys, and household essentials saw noticeable price increases. This regressive economic impact meant that lower-income households, which spend a greater portion of their income on goods rather than services, were disproportionately hurt. The administration's claim that China was paying the tariffs collapsed under scrutiny as multiple independent analyses confirmed that U.S. importers, and ultimately U.S. consumers, were the ones footing the bill. As the trade war intensified, major American exporters began to feel the squeeze. Companies that relied on global markets suddenly faced shrinking demand and a chaotic policy environment. Iconic American brands reported losses linked to tariff retaliation. The uncertainty generated by shifting trade rules discouraged long-term investment, weakened confidence in supply chain stability, and forced businesses to spend valuable time and money navigating an increasingly fragmented international landscape. The administration touted isolated factory openings and minor reshoring efforts as proof of success, but these anecdotes could not offset the broader trend of instability and economic drag. What's more, the economic disruption caused by the trade raid war required further federal spending to contain its effects. The $28 billion farm bailout program spread over 2 years exceeded the total cost of the 2008 auto industry bailout. It was authorized unilaterally by the executive branch, bypassing congressional debate, and presented as an emergency measure. But the need for such a bailout was entirely self-inflicted. This was not the result of a natural disaster or economic downturn. It was the product of deliberate policy choices that ignored the realities of a deeply interconnected global economy. Once again, taxpayer money was used to cover up the consequences of a politically driven agenda And once again, the benefits flowed to those with the most political clout. Beyond the numbers, the trade war revealed the extent to which economic policy can be weaponized for short-term political theater rather than long-term strategic planning. The administration framed tariffs as a blunt force tool to extract concessions from trading partners, but in reality, they lacked a coherent follow-through strategy. Trade negotiations were erratic and sometimes contradictory. Allies were alienated. Global institutions were sidelined. Instead of building multilateral coalitions to pressure trade violators, the U.S. pursued a go-it-alone strategy that left it increasingly isolated and vulnerable to countermeasures. The fallout extended beyond economics into diplomacy, weakening America's standing and credibility on the world stage. The public narrative that the U.S. was finally standing up to unfair trade practices played well in campaign rallies, but did little to address the structural issues that have eroded American industry for decades. The real drivers of deindustrialization, automation, financialization, and decades of offshoring driven by corporate profit seeking were left unaddressed. Instead of investing in worker retraining, modern infrastructure, or technology innovation, the administration focused on punitive measures that hurt more than they helped. The illusion of decisive action concealed a lack of meaningful solutions. While the administration insisted that trade wars were easy to win, the end result was a policy that left behind broken supply chains, anxious markets, and a growing pile of public debt. The federal aid packages intended to soften the blow were temporary bandages that did nothing to fix the underlying damage. Meanwhile, public money that could have gone toward climate resilience, health systems, or affordable housing was redirected to subsidize the losses caused by self-inflicted wounds. The mismanagement of the trade war served as a textbook example of how economic nationalism, when implemented without a deep understanding of global systems, leads to unintended consequences that are both expensive and damaging. The narrative of public sacrifice in the name of American resurgence was never matched by shared prosperity. The rewards went to the top, while the costs were socialized. This is the essence of how elite-driven policies are masked as populist reforms, when in fact they reproduce the same patterns of inequality, inefficiency, and exploitation that have defined American economic policy for decades. The Trump administration's aggressive push toward deregulation was framed as a liberation of the American economy from bureaucratic overreach. It was marketed as a necessary correction to the so-called burdens imposed by previous administrations, especially in the realms of finance, labor, and the environment. Supporters claimed it would unleash business potential, drive investment, and return control to the people. But what actually occurred was a systematic dismantling of public protections that had been built up over decades to shield citizens from the unchecked power of large corporations. The result was not efficiency or innovation, but a greater concentration of power in the hands of corporate elites, a weakening of public institutions, and the deliberate erosion of mechanisms meant to hold economic power accountable. One of the first areas to face sweeping changes was financial regulation. The administration rolled back significant portions of the Dodd-Frank Act, a legislative response to the 2008 financial crisis designed to prevent another collapse. Stress tests for major banks were weakened. Oversight of consumer lending was relaxed, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the very agency tasked with defending ordinary Americans from predatory financial practices, was effectively neutered. These changes did not make the economy safer or more resilient. Instead, they allowed the same risky behaviors that triggered the last financial collapse to re-emerge, with banks taking on greater leverage and speculative investment while enjoying record profits and bonuses. All of this happened while millions of Americans continued to struggle with stagnant wages, rising debt, and increasingly insecure employment. Labor protections were another target. The administration worked to undermine worker power at nearly every turn. Efforts to raise the federal minimum wage were blocked. Overtime protections were rolled back. Union rights were eroded through executive orders and court appointments sympathetic to corporate interests. One of the most telling examples was the narrowing of the joint employer standard, which made it more difficult for workers in franchises or contracted labor situations to hold the parent companies accountable for violations. In practice, this meant fewer protections for gig workers, fewer avenues for collective bargaining, and a labor market skewed even more heavily in favor of employers. Deregulation in this context did not produce freedom, it produced vulnerability. Environmental regulation saw some of the most visible and far-reaching rollbacks. The Trump administration withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement, relaxed fuel efficiency standards, and lifted restrictions on fossil fuel extraction in protected lands and waters. The Environmental Protection Agency itself was gutted, both in terms of funding and mission. Scientists were pushed out, reports were suppressed, and corporate lobbyists were appointed to oversee industries they had previously worked for. The logic was always the same. Environmental rules were seen as impediments to growth. But this short-term thinking ignored the long-term costs. Climate instability, poisoned water, polluted air, and the deterioration of public health. Communities already marginalized and economically vulnerable bore the brunt of these changes, facing increased exposure to toxins and degraded living conditions while corporations walked away with greater profits and fewer obligations. These deregulations were not accidental or isolated. They were part of a deliberate ideological project rooted in neoliberalism and corporate supremacy. By removing guardrails, the administration signaled to the private sector that profit would be prioritized over people, that the public interest would take a back seat to shareholder value. This created a business climate where accountability was optional and exploitation was normalized. The consequences extended beyond the economic realm and into the social fabric as trust in public institutions declined and a sense of democratic disempowerment took hold. People no longer believed that government could or would protect them because in many cases it no longer did. Deregulation also amplified systemic inequalities. Wealthy individuals and powerful corporations had the resources to navigate or even exploit the changing landscape. They could hire lawyers, lobbyists, and compliance teams. But small businesses, working class families, and marginalized communities lacked the same tools. When food safety inspections were reduced, when labor standards were weakened, when environmental safeguards were scrapped, it was these groups that suffered. The safety net was ripped apart, not just figuratively, but literally. And once again, public resources were redirected, not toward strengthening resilience or building equity, but toward subsidizing risk and failure for the most privileged actors in the economy. One of the more insidious outcomes of this deregulation spree was the erosion of crisis preparedness. Regulations often exist not just to manage current conditions, but to prevent future disasters. By dismantling oversight in industries like healthcare, pharmaceuticals, and emergency response, the administration made the country more vulnerable to shock events, economic downturns, environmental catastrophes, and public health emergencies. When crises inevitably occurred, the government found itself underprepared, understaffed, and reliant on private actors who were more interested in profit than public welfare. This pattern repeated across multiple sectors, exposing a fundamental flaw in the deregulation narrative that markets, when left alone, will self-correct and serve the common good. In reality, markets serve those who already hold power, and deregulation simply removes the few constraints that exist to mitigate that imbalance. The administration's approach to deregulation was also marked by a profound disregard for science and expertise. Agencies that once relied on rigorous data and peer-reviewed research were increasingly politicized, with leadership selected based on loyalty rather than qualification. Decisions about health, safety, and the environment were made not based on evidence, but on ideological alignment with business interests. This undermined not just specific policies, but the very idea that government should be informed by fact and reason. It fueled a broader cultural shift toward cynicism and disinformation, where truth became negotiable and trust in institutions eroded even further. The rollback of regulations was often justified under the banner of freedom and efficiency, but it was a one-sided freedom for corporations to pollute, exploit, and profiteer without consequences. It was not freedom for workers, for consumers, for communities, or for future generations. Efficiency, too, became a euphemism. What was made more efficient was the transfer of wealth from the public sphere to the private sector, the dismantling of collective protections, and the acceleration of extractive practices that benefited the few while harming the many. Throughout this period, the deregulatory agenda was championed not just as policy, but as a political identity. It was wrapped in nationalist rhetoric, economic populism, and anti-establishment flair, but behind the slogans was a stark reality. Public institutions were hollowed out, corporate influence deepened, and the balance of power shifted even further away from ordinary people. When analyzing the broader economic consequences of the Trump administration's policies, it becomes evident that the public cost wasn't just theoretical, it was tangible, measurable, and deeply consequential. Over $1 trillion in public wealth was either squandered, redirected, or handed out to corporate entities and elites, and the opportunity cost of that loss is staggering. That kind of capital could have transformed the American social and economic landscape. The country has long faced critical gaps in infrastructure, education, healthcare, and environmental resilience. That $1 trillion could have been deployed to meet those needs, not in abstract terms, but in specific, life-altering ways for millions of citizens. Instead, that sum was consumed by policies that failed to generate long-term economic benefit, widened inequality, and left public systems starved for resources while private profits soared. In the realm of education alone, $1 trillion could have ensured tuition, free public college for nearly a generation, Student loan debt currently weighs down over 40 million Americans, creating a drag on the economy and limiting the upward mobility of an entire demographic. With higher education increasingly treated as a private luxury rather than a public good, many students are forced to take on crushing debt simply to access the tools needed to participate in the modern economy. That $1 trillion could have changed that dynamic. Public universities could have been revitalized, teachers properly paid, and the next generation equipped with the knowledge and skills needed to lead in a rapidly evolving world. Instead, those funds disappeared into tax breaks for corporations, bailouts for agricultural conglomerates, and inflated stock buyback schemes. Healthcare is another critical area where that money could have made a transformative impact. The United States continues to spend more on healthcare than any other developed country, yet ranks poorly in key outcomes such as life expectancy, maternal mortality, and access to basic services. $1 trillion investment in healthcare could have expanded Medicaid in every state, strengthened the Affordable Care Act subsidies, and provided seed funding for a more ambitious public option or single payer system. Rural hospitals that have been closing at alarming rates could have been preserved. Prescription drug costs could have been slashed through negotiated pricing and public manufacturing initiatives. Instead, the healthcare system remains fragmented and profit-driven, with millions still uninsured or underinsured, while pharmaceutical and insurance companies report record profits year after year. Then there's infrastructure, an area where economists across the political spectrum agree that public investment is sorely needed. Roads, bridges, rail systems, water pipes, and public transit networks across the country are outdated, crumbling, or dangerously underfunded. $1 trillion injection into infrastructure could have created millions of well-paying jobs while modernizing the physical foundation of the American economy. It could have funded climate resilient upgrades to cities and towns, improved energy efficiency in public buildings, and expanded clean water access to communities long neglected. The long-term economic multiplier effect of such investment would have been substantial, supporting small businesses, reducing transportation costs, and attracting future private capital. Instead, those funds were redirected to policies that disproportionately benefited those least in need of government assistance. Affordable housing is yet another realm where this scale of funding could have reshaped lives. America is in the midst of a housing crisis with skyrocketing rents, increasing homelessness, and declining public housing stock. With $1 trillion, cities could have built or refurbished millions of affordable housing units, addressing chronic shortages and stabilizing local economies. Zoning reforms could have been paired with federal grants to encourage equitable development. Housing first policies to address homelessness could have been scaled nationwide. Instead of solving a crisis, the opportunity was lost to a tax policy that concentrated wealth at the top and left structural problems untouched. The same can be said for climate policy. The existential threat of climate change requires urgent and massive investment. $1 trillion could have supercharged the transition to renewable energy, funding solar and wind installations, modernizing the electric grid, and retraining fossil fuel workers for green jobs. It could have supported research into carbon capture, battery storage, and sustainable agriculture. It could have fortified coastal regions, improved disaster preparedness, and ensured environmental justice for frontline communities that bear the brunt of pollution and environmental degradation. Yet this historic opportunity to act was ignored in favor of short-term corporate windfalls and deregulation that actively worsened environmental risks. Beyond the material possibilities, the symbolic and political importance of this lost investment cannot be overstated. The redirection of $1 trillion to elite interests represented a choice, one that reinforced existing power structures and deepened public disillusionment with government. It signaled that the state would not act as a vehicle for collective improvement, but as a facilitator of private enrichment. This undermines not only economic equality, but democratic legitimacy. People lose faith in institutions when they see trillions handed to the wealthy while their schools crumble, their hospitals close, and their communities fall further behind. It fosters resentment, cynicism, and polarization, conditions ripe for authoritarianism and political instability. The human cost of these decisions is impossible to fully quantify. It lives in the lost opportunities, the delayed dreams, the illnesses untreated, the lives cut short. It's visible in young people forced to abandon higher education, in families bankrupted by medical emergencies, in workers commuting for hours because they can't afford to live near their jobs. It's felt by parents choosing between rent and medicine, by veterans sleeping on the streets, by entire communities left behind in a system that chooses profits over people. These are not abstract policy failures. They are daily, grinding realities for millions, shaped by decisions made in Washington and executed under the guise of economic freedom. At every turn, that $1 trillion could have been the engine of renewal. It could have launched a new era of American progress, one that lifted everyone rather than rewarding a few. It could have been a down payment on a more just, equitable, and resilient future. That money was not spent in a vacuum. It was spent instead on policies that privileged the wealthy, neglected the vulnerable, and mortgaged the future.